Aloha. Yes, I am fresh off the plane from our big trip to the big island of Hawaii. Tan hasn't faded yet, and I will be finding sand in the backpack for a long time, but the most powerful impression of my island time is what I can see when I close my eyes. Yes, there were gorgeous beaches, lush greenery, eye-popping colors everywhere, but what really made me feel somewhere else were the archaeological remnants of another time. Everywhere we went, we saw piles of stones, sometimes from seawalls battered by coastal surges, or maybe dilapidated stone fences from old ranches. But most fascinating to me were the remains of ancient temples called heiau, where the old religion was practiced until 1819, when it was abolished by King Kamehameha II. Some of the temples were intentionally destroyed to make room for the new religion, Christianity, and the sugarcane plantations as well, while others just crumbled over time. Some have been rebuilt, but mostly what you see are stone platforms in varying stages of decay. It's a weird feeling standing at the foot of what used to be a major temple. With a little imagination, you can almost picture it in its former glory, so tall, built to be imposing for the mortals who approached to make their offerings or to become offerings. Black lava stones so carefully placed, held together by mass, not mortar. Some of the walls 4 feet thick or more. It must have seemed like they would last forever, those shrines that were believed to house the very gods upon whom the people's lives depended. 200 years ago, what Hawaiian could have imagined their majestic heiau in ruins? That's what comes to my mind when reading our lesson this week, which is from the 21st chapter of Luke. Here we find Jesus and his followers in Jerusalem visiting the temple, the holiest of holy places for everyone who practiced their religion. They were admiring the massive structure built of sturdy stones and meant to impress the faithful with the enduring majesty of God Almighty. This temple was the architectural triumph of their culture, and though it probably paled in comparison to the original temple built by Solomon, it was nothing to sneeze at. This second temple had stood there for about 500 years, and just 50 years before Jesus' followers were standing there admiring it, King Herod the Great had spiffed it up quite nicely. Now, Jesus' friends probably were not big fans of that particular monarch. Remember, he was the one who had had an entire village of baby boys murdered in a botched attempt on baby Jesus' own life. But he didn't have to like the king to appreciate what he had done with the temple. It was a thing of rare beauty, and they were taking it all in. Then, according to Luke, starting at verse 5, this is what happened. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, he said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray. For many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and 'the time is near.' Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls." Well, I bet they didn't see that coming. There they were, getting ready to take some really great selfies. Come on, they were at the temple with Jesus. What would you do? But instead of smiling for the group photo, Jesus predicted the total destruction of that beautiful temple. He was a great teacher, but a terrible tour guide. However, he was right. In just 40 years, that would happen. The temple would be destroyed, because nothing built by human hands, not the Temple of Jerusalem, not the heiau of Hawaii, not even towns named for eternal beauty like paradise, nothing made by mortal hands can last forever. Yet we hate to think of it, right? Picture the most inspiring building you've ever seen. There you are standing in front of it, taking it all in, and what if someone whispered in your ear, this place is going to become rubble, all of it totally destroyed? You'd find that incredulous. You might even notify someone with a uniform and a badge. You would want to know more. What exactly is going to happen, and how do you know? How will any of us know? To see it coming? Maybe to prevent it? You cannot blame Jesus' disciples then for asking the same question. Teacher, when will this be, and what will be the sign that this is about to take place? But Jesus doesn't even answer their question, as he's been doing quite often lately, according to Luke's gospel. He redirects the conversation, giving them something else to think about. Beware, you are not led astray, for many will come in my name and say, I am he, and the time is near. Do not go after them. And then he gets into some really heavy stuff, maybe even more disturbing than the future destruction of the temple, if possible. He talks of wars and insurrections, great earthquakes, famines and plagues, and more vaguely, these dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. What's worse, he warns that they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you'll be brought before kings and governors because of my name. If that sounds terrifying, just imagine if you were his intended audience. Because guess what? We aren't. This little speech was not intended for our ears unless we were willing and able to time travel to the year 30. Jesus didn't have his modern day disciples in mind when he said these words. But oh, how they rang true some 50-ish years later when the author of Luke recorded it. In those last decades of the first century, people really were being persecuted, even killed, for their loyalty to the Jesus cause. As for the great temple, well, what was impossible for Jesus' contemporaries to imagine was an incontestable historical fact for Luke's audience, who remembered the destruction of the temple probably just a couple decades prior. It is hard as modern-day followers of Jesus to distinguish between the teachings that shaped the lives of all disciples in all times and the words that really only made sense for Jesus' contemporaries. And sometimes we don't make that distinction. I would like to suggest that we learn how to do that, because in this passage there is a bit of both. There are timeless lessons for people of our faith, and there are also dated references to events of the distant past. There's something else we need to realize too. This is an example of apocalyptic literature. All this talk of nation rising against nation, earthquakes, famines, those dreadful portents from the heavens, Jesus was using a style of rhetoric well known in his time, modeled after a genre of literature that we see in some of the writings of the post-exilic period. Examples include older books like Daniel and Ezra, and the same style is used much later in that infamous Revelation of John. The thing to know about apocalyptic literature is not to take it literally. It's not meant to be. Rather, it's written almost poetically, using unsettling language and images to assure people of faith to trust in God even in hard times. And that's what Jesus was doing in this passage, listing all sorts of terrible, awful things that would bring any of us to our knees. And he says, do not be terrified. Kind of like something an angel once said to a girl named Mary, fear not, for the Lord is with you. Jesus' point was not to draw a detailed map of the future, but to state rather generically that bad things are going to happen because they do in every age. For as long as people have been keeping track, right? Natural disaster, war, plague, famine, dreadful and mysterious portents from the skies. Imagine solar eclipses, how terrifying that must have been to a primitive people who didn't understand what was happening in the universe or even how it was constructed. All of those things will happen, promises Jesus, but the good news, you don't have to be afraid. Why not? Because God is with you. This was an essential message for Jesus to preach to his followers just days before his arrest and crucifixion, because he knew that they who followed him would be tested and tried, some of them killed, as we will learn from the book of Acts, the sequel to Luke's gospel. And this author, who was writing to members of the early church, was absolutely going to hone in on that theme, playing up the pep talk. Don't consider this to be the end of the world, rather an opportunity to testify. And don't worry so much about what you're going to say when the time comes, because when it does, Jesus will give you the words and the wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to contradict or withstand. Even if your own family members turn their backs on you, which absolutely happened to some first century Christians, not a hair of your head will perish. Which again, Jesus did not mean literally, for he has just said they will put some of you to death. Not a hair of your head perishing was an expression, a Jewish proverbial way of implying divine protection, because no matter what might happen to his followers here on earth, Jesus wanted them to know that they would never be separated from God's steadfast love. This is a call to faith, to courage in times of trial, to the kind of spiritual endurance that would allow Jesus' followers to gain their souls. His followers in the first century, remember? Right, so what are we to make of this passage? Is it just historically interesting, or is there any valid application to our actual lives in the 21st century? Well, we can breathe a sigh of relief about the temple, I think, because it is very clear that Jesus is predicting the destruction of a certain temple that none of us have had the privilege to see, as it was destroyed in the year 70. As for predictions of famine, war, plague, all the rest of it, Jesus was speaking of things that happen in every age. Just because there's a great earthquake, volcanic eruption, doesn't mean that we need to run around holding signs saying the end is near, because it may be and it may not be. And our job is not to look for signs of the end, but rather to live faithfully into the present reality that we have been given, which is hard to do if you are obsessed on some future event that no one will ever be able to predict. Will life as we know it cease to exist someday? Will the structures and social structures that we know and maybe love fall to ruins? Jesus seems to suggest that this is so. In fact, at the heart of his message was always a call to dismantle some of those very systems that always seemed so essential until the walls came tumbling down and the world didn't actually end. Every valley shall be lifted, every mountain made low, right? The end of the world as we know it. Now, how many times have people thought it really was at hand? And all that fell was another empire, another monarch, walls made to separate and alienate human beings from human beings and everyone from God's will. It always feels like the end of the world when the mighty institutions come crashing down, but the sun eventually does set on every empire that is not built upon justice for all. The end was, in fact, not terribly far away for the mighty Roman Empire of Jesus' time, but Rome wouldn't fall before it had destroyed the temple to punish Jesus' people for a failed rebellion. Jesus probably recognized the signs of these things coming, and yet he explicitly warned his followers against falling into the trap of looking for signs of the end or following those who claim to see them. And although that advice was given to his close followers in the year 30, I think it pertains to us today, because do you remember that time the final judgment was predicted? Which time? For fun, I Googled predictions of the apocalypse, and whoa, that was fun. There were about 10, at least in the first 1,000 years of Christianity, a bunch more in the next 400 years, a ton in 1500. They really like those multiples of 500. And well, remember the year 2000? That got a lot of disastrous predictions, and they keep coming. People claim to know the year, the date, sometimes even the hour, either of the second coming of Christ or the end of the world, generically speaking. And my best advice is to steer clear of all things like that, because that is what Jesus told us to do. What Jesus meant for his followers to focus on, his followers now as his followers then, was to stay faithful to God, even in hard times, which are actually wonderful opportunities to testify to our faith, and to keep our heads and our hearts focused on the path of discipleship, which means occasionally looking away from the beauty and splendor of human-built structures, even our own gorgeous houses of worship, so that we can see where we are called to be disciples. It is no mistake, I think, that Luke tells this anecdote immediately after recounting the story of a certain widow who gave her last 2 coins to the treasury, alongside the rich who were putting in amounts far greater in value but not nearly as meaningful to them as those 2 coins were to the widow. In the temple, it is this act that Jesus sees, something that might not have been noticed by anyone else that day, but that is what he called his disciples to see and to notice. Not just an act of generosity and sacrifice, but the jarring discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots. The lived faith of the widow compared to the going through the motions actions of the wealthy. And then his disciples look around, their eyes dazzled by the precious stones and the great gifts shining and golden and glittering to the glory of God in that temple. And Jesus says, yeah, none of that's going to last. And that really bothers them. Yet it doesn't seem to have bothered them that a widow just walked into that bejeweled temple and put her last 2 coins into the treasury, offering all that she had to live upon. Her own personal end of the world moment may have just happened before their very eyes, and they didn't see it. What would Jesus like us to see in our time and place? Are there still people who struggle to keep body and soul together? People struggling with addiction and healthy future? What about children in poverty? Some of these problems, I confess to you, they terrify me. I wonder what on earth are we to do? And then I think of Jesus' words, do not be terrified. Consider the hard times an opportunity to testify, and I realize that is the good news that Jesus' words can offer even today. Friends, we live in a time of great trouble and terrifying events on a weekly, daily basis, right? This doesn't mean that we need to duck and cover, isolating ourselves from the world and just wait for Jesus to show up and fix it. It does mean that we are supposed to testify to our faith through words and actions, though some might consider it odd that we should care so much about the plight of the poor or the planet. But our Jesus calls us even now to live courageously as faithful agents of his love and grace, here and now, because kingdoms will rise and fall, temples, cathedrals, sometimes whole towns will burn to the ground, but in the meantime, there's work to do. Bricks and mortar, no matter how lovely, are not meant to last, but the legacy of faithful love and compassion, that is the thing that endures. Our lived statement of faith, our testimony to a world that may scorn the absurdity of our meager efforts compared to the vast troubles of the world. Do not be afraid, said Jesus. Let the storms come, let the thunder roll. It is not the end of the world. As long as you stay faithful to your calling, keep your faith, live your faith. That is the one thing that will endure. Change is not the end of the world, but we who follow Jesus can change the world. Because that is the end of the story, according to Scripture. It's a beautiful ending, one that we are helping to write. What then will it be like when the world is restored into God's will for love and justice and harmony among all people and all of creation? We dare even now to imagine such joy, and to that we sing. There'll be joy in the morning on that day. There'll be joy in the morning on that day. For the day that will dawn when the darkness is gone. There'll be joy in the morning on that day. There'll be peace and contentment evermore. There'll be peace and contentment evermore. Every heart, every voice on that day will rejoice. There'll be peace and contentment evermore. Amen. God bless you and keep you, and may you be well.